Okay, well, I think we'll make a start, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you this morning, and thank you for joining us first thing. I do hope that it's a very pleasant day wherever you are. The forecast is quite reasonable countrywide. I hope you can see me clearly enough. I'm Kenneth Shand. I'm a corporate partner at Dentons and the firm's senior partner in Scotland. This seemed from the moment that we heard that the Prime Minister would be addressing us on Sunday evening a timely opportunity to address the key issues facing businesses and indeed their employees as we move into the next phase of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic in the UK. Our guests this morning, thank you for joining us again. You come from a wide range of business sectors, so we're very much looking forward to hearing your perspectives at what is a key moment as we begin to explore what coming out of lockdown actually means in practice. It's pretty complicated, as I think we can see from listening to the media over the last day or two, probably more so, much more so than going into lockdown in many ways. So hopefully over the next hour or so, we can begin to shine a light on some of the complexities with a little bit of help from you on the situations that you see facing your own businesses. If I can begin by introducing our speakers, I'm joined by three colleagues this morning. I hope you can see them all on the screen. They're all well versed in some of the main areas that we will have to navigate as a nation in the weeks and months ahead. Firstly, Helen Bowdren, a partner who specialises in regulatory and operational compliance issues. Then Sarah Jackman, whose career has seen her leading the employment law team at one of the major clearing banks, alongside many years in private practice with our firm. And Malcolm Gunyon, he's the bearded one, one of our dispute resolution partners, whose practice has a particular focus on health and safety matters. Now, just to say at this juncture, as my colleagues begin to chip in, you might just notice that 3 of the 4 of us have Scottish accents. Now, I'd like to assure you that this is purely coincidental, but we certainly aren't here to press a Scottish message or perspective at a time when there are clear challenges arising from different approaches between Westminster and the devolved administrations. However, I'm sure these differences will come up in the course of our conversation. Just on housekeeping, I think you will see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A icon. Do please click on that and raise any questions that come to mind as we're talking, and we'll pick them up as the conversation unfolds, and particularly further down the line. So perhaps I can start by asking you, Helen, to remind us where we're at in the process and the timeline we might see ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth, and good morning, everybody. So we had Boris Johnson's speech on Sunday night announcing some easing of the lockdown measures in England only, and it's important to say that most of those restrictions, are still in place in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland for the time being until further notice. So for some businesses, the new guidance will only apply to England at this point. And then yesterday, the government published some more detailed guidance on the rules applying to England, and also some guidance on particular workplace settings. So there's 8 separate documents published yesterday, not so much sectors, but more, I would say, workplace settings. So it may well be that within your operations, you may be looking at 1 or 2 or even 3 of those guides, because you may have people working in different workplace settings. So for example, there's one on construction and other outdoor work. There's one on factories, plants and warehouses. There's one on people who work inside other people's homes, one on labs and research facilities, one on offices and contact centres, restaurants offering takeaway and delivery, shops and branches, and there's also some guidance specifically on people who work in vehicles. So if any of those are relevant, I would recommend having a look at them. And then today we're expecting the Chancellor to announce something in relation to the furlough scheme, the job retention scheme, which is due to end currently on the 30th of June. but we think there's going to be some announcement on potentially extending that and how that scheme's going to wind down. And then tomorrow, Wednesday, those lockdown easing measures will come into force in England. The next step that the Prime Minister set out is step 2, which they think will happen at the earliest 1st of June. And that will be when there'll be some phased reopening of schools, particularly primary schools, and also some childcare settings, so nurseries and childminders. So for those of us, including me with a toddler, that was probably the most interesting part of the guidance to see. And then step 3, which would be at the earliest 4th of July, we're expecting to see a potential easing of measures on the hospitality industry and also on some public gatherings, for example, places of worship. But again, those dates are not fixed and very much going to depend on what the situation is looking like with the epidemic at the time. And there's also going to be a quarantine period imposed, I think, by the end of the month on travellers arriving from abroad, but that will exclude, at this point, the Republic of Ireland and France, we believe.
Thanks, Helen. So to start to get into the meat of some of the specific questions that our guests are likely to have on their minds, let's start off with a pretty key question. If you're an employer and your employees cannot work from home, you'd like to reopen the business to get cranking back up, what do you have to do to comply with the law? So
I'll start off with that one. Thanks, Kenneth, and others may chip in as well. I think if you're an employer and you are looking at some kind of phased reopening of workplaces that have previously been closed, the first thing clearly is going to be to look at the guidance from the government and any of that specific workplace setting guidance that's been issued as well, and consider how that might apply. I'd definitely also consider whether your industry bodies have published any guidance. I know, for example, the construction industry, there's been some sector-specific guidance that's actually very useful and probably quite a lot more granular and detailed than the government guidance, so that may well be useful. But it's very clear from what we know about the legal position anyway, and also from the guidance documents, that the government is expecting this to be an employer's risk assessment that needs to take place, and that employers will be responsible for doing that risk assessment and looking at not just COVID related risks, but all of the risks to your workforce, and also putting in place measures to mitigate those risks. And I would say that will probably be quite a complex exercise. And if you're involving, internal health and safety professionals or perhaps external consultants, you may well find that those people have not done risk assessments in relation to infectious disease control before. So there may be quite a lot of learning as you go on this. And I would say, don't rush it. It will need to be very specific to the nature of your business, the nature of your operations, your workforce, and you will probably have lots of different risk assessments for each of your different premises and different work activities that are going on. So although the government's encouraging people back to work from Wednesday, our sense is that actually this clearly is quite a complex process that will need some time to think through properly. And there is in the guidance, there's an expectation that any employer with more than 50 employees will be publishing their risk assessments. That's not normally the case. That's normally something that you'd expect to be a private document within a company. It's not a requirement, but it's been stated as an expectation. And I have seen quite a lot of commentary from trade unions, for example, that they're looking for those risk assessments to be published. And it may well be that that's an important part of, if you like, the hearts and minds aspect of this, of helping your employees to feel that it is in fact safe to come back to work. You will need to consider any additional arrangements for vulnerable members of staff, but also for staff who are living with vulnerable members within their household. You'll probably need to think about social distancing, how you're actually going to implement that in your workplace, signage, one-way usage, perhaps restricting usage in the lifts, that kind of thing, staggered start times, frequent cleaning. So there'll be quite a lot of quite important operational changes. On PPE, the guidance hasn't specifically recommended that employers use PPE for specifically to guard against COVID risk outside of clinical settings, clinical and healthcare settings. Some of you may have businesses which already use PPE because of the risks in place, and obviously you would continue to do that. I would say on PPE, I think you need to do your own risk assessment. And if you think that actually PPE is going to help you in mitigating risks for your staff, I think you should, don't rule it out just because the government hasn't pushed it and hasn't made it mandatory. I think you need to do your own risk assessment on that. And you will, of course, I think, really need to consider the way in which your employees travel to work as well. So the risk assessment might be a bit wider than it would be in normal times. Clearly, public transport is going to be a huge issue. The government's asking employers to make facilities available for staff to come in by bicycle so that they can lock up their bikes. But if you've got lots of people coming in also needing showers, then you're also going to need to think about the infection control in those areas as well quite carefully. And testing as well. The government testing regime is now available to not just essential workers, but also anyone who is working and cannot work from home. So in theory, either the employer can make a referral for an employee to get a test through that, or the employee can approach the scheme directly. But there are also private testing regimes available to corporates, so that might be an option that you want to go down. But I would have thought that testing's probably going to be part of your strategy for most larger companies. And if you are, for example, asking people to do temperature checks or to participate in testing if they're symptomatic, then any data relating to that will of course be sensitive personal data. So you'll need to make sure that you're managing that, storing that, processing that, all of that in accordance with the data protection requirements as well. You may want to liaise with unions if you have a unionised workforce. You may also need to consider whether you need to talk to your insurers about the change in arrangements, whether they need to be notified. And other notifications, you may also want to consider whether your customers need to be told about the new arrangements, and also possibly your regulator. So for example, for coma sites, if you're making changes to your coma plan, then you'll probably need to inform the Health and Safety Executive of that as well. And I'm sure that there'll be, I think for most businesses, there'll be a period of consultation with employees as well to talk about the new arrangements. And maybe that's a good time for me to hand over to you, Sarah, to talk about that aspect of it.
Absolutely. Very much a focus in the guidance on discussing with employees, on consultation with union representatives when you're deciding what measures you're going to put in place. And that's seen as part of the journey to getting employees on board and accepting the changes that you're making. Someone's asking a question about, if you put safety measures in, can you enforce them? Can you insist that people social distance? Can you insist that people wear special equipment? And absolutely, you need to be able to do that in order to ensure that your workplace is safe, and therefore that needs to be in the messaging. And I think companies will enforce that strictly, and quite rightly so, due to the importance of it and the implications if the restrictions are breached. So we're hoping for situations that avoids us relying on misconduct in order to enforce this, getting employees on board, building the trust with employees so that they understand that what you're doing are steps to protect them in the workplace, so that managers understand the importance of that, and so that they can deal with and respond to concerns that employees might raise in the workplace about things that they feel uncertain about.
Malcolm, one of the questions that come up this morning is, and I'll just read it out, if it is the company's responsibility to risk assess their employees' exposure to COVID, then does that mean that the company is potentially liable for legal and civil claims if the control measures fail in any way?
The short answer is yes, at least potentially. None of this actually changes the underlying legal position, which is the same between Scotland and England. The Health and Safety at Work Act remains the primary piece of legislation. this is just another tier, as Helen said, of risk assessment on top of that. So if a company fails to put in place all reasonably practicable measures to minimise their employees' exposure to COVID-19, then yes, the HSE could come in and do an investigation and conclude that there'd been a failure, and that would then be a potential prosecution of the company under criminal law, both in Scotland and in England. Civil liability claims, I've been saying up to now, are going to be much more difficult, because one of the key elements of a civil claim will be the employee establishing where they contracted COVID-19. And that's quite difficult, given the number of places that any person can get it. As we develop the system of contact tracing, that may become more straightforward for an employee to demonstrate with a degree of certainty that they contracted COVID-19 in the workplace, or that they contracted it in the supermarket. So there's definitely a potential liability there. I think the thing to say is that none of the legal tests, whether they're under the health and safety legislation or civil negligence duties, none of it requires an employee to eliminate a risk. It's recognised that that's not possible. What employers have to do is what is reasonably practicable. And the guidance that came out, yes, is actually quite helpful in the sense that it's not too granular, as Helen has said. It is a guidance as to how employers should look at things like cleaning, sanitation, how to maintain social distancing in the workplace. So it's not an absolute guarantee that if you comply with that guidance that you will have a complete defence, but that's certainly the best way to minimise the risk of any claims, and also to liaise with your employer's liability insurers to make sure that any conditions they want to see imposed on a return to work are met. The one thing I should say from a Scottish perspective, before I forget to do so, is that actually, whilst it's frustrating in some respects that there is a divergence between the devolved administrations, and Helen may disagree, but I think it's unlikely that the guidance that comes out in Scotland when we reach a point of reopening workplaces up here, it's not going to be any different, I don't think. The legislation's the same. It would be very difficult, I think, for there to be material differences between the guidance in England and the guidance that is put in place in Northern Ireland, in Wales and in Scotland. So for businesses that have premises out with England, and I know there are a number of you joining us this morning who do, now is the time to start reading the guidance and to start thinking about how you'll implement that in your workplaces in parts of the UK that are not England, because there's an opportunity effectively to steal a march. Instead of having 48 hours notice of potential reopening, you have a much longer window to put these things in place.
Yeah.
A couple of the questions coming through relate to travel to work arrangements. First of all, would you say, Helen, that would or should form part of the employer's risk assessment process? And then a follow-on question: or is it the company's responsibility, with the possibility of liability attaching to it, as Malcolm has identified, to risk assess travel arrangements, or is that down to the employee?
This is a really tricky one. I think that if companies are, if they have employees who cannot work from home due to the nature of their job, and clearly the starting position is still, even in England, you know, if your employees can work from home, you should do everything to facilitate that as an employer. So that's the starting point. But if you have activities that simply cannot be done from home, and you need your employees to come into work, then I think the duty to reduce risks so far as reasonably practicable would extend to considering how they're getting to work and what facilities they might then need at work. You know, for example, showers because they've come in on a bicycle, or some kind of, if they've come off the tube because they've got no other option, for example, at least some kind of facilities right at the entrance where they can wash their hands and perhaps some hand sanitizer or something like that. As we say, it's reducing the risks so far as reasonably practicable. And so I don't think the government's saying that if you have a workforce that comes to work on public transport, that means you can't open. You know, they're asking people not to take public transport wherever possible and to use other means. But I think that under the overall duty that you have as an employer under health and safety law towards your employees and to others who are affected by your business, and also in civil liability terms, a breach of a duty of care giving rise to a negligence claim. I think on both of those, the test would be, you know, have you done what's reasonably practicable?
I think, sorry to interrupt you, Helen, there may be some practical things to think about for staff who will be getting public transport in, such as, can we change their start times so it's not at the busiest points of the day? Permission not to get on a train if that one is particularly busy, but to step back and wait for the next one. Comfort that you're not going to be disciplined for being late in that circumstance, and just these sorts of sensible measures, which are really just getting down to the nitty-gritty of what people practically need to do to get into the building safely, and doing so in a supportive way.
Sarah, what would you say? I mean, if staff indicate they're not comfortable with coming back to the workplace, or you know, flat out refuse, what would you say to an employer in those circumstances?
So this is the big question at the moment, and this is the situation that everybody's trying to avoid. So everything that is being done in the risk assessment planning process is to try and make it as safe as possible, and to ensure that employees have confidence and comfort that working in the workplace is going to be as safe as possible. So largely it's about communication, it's about understanding the individual circumstances and responding to those individual circumstances, not treating everybody the same, which can feel a bit uncomfortable, which can make people a bit worried that they're going to trip themselves up for discriminatory reasons. But we need to face up to the fact that certain people in different groups need to be treated differently, and the guidance refers to that. There's specific guidance on who should be coming back to work if you cannot work from home. The clinically extremely vulnerable should not be. The clinically vulnerable ideally should be working from home, and if they can't, then specific steps to make them safe. Trying to adjust the job, giving them the safest jobs available with the most social distance. There might be situations though that isn't going to work yet, and you're going to have those conversations. The key focus should be on listening to the concerns. Are those concerns reasonable? If you've done everything that's reasonably practical to make it safe, then they might not be reasonable. But on the other hand, they might be. And if they are, and the employee can say that they've got a reasonable belief that there's a serious and imminent danger to them and to their health and safety, then there's a potential claim that they can raise, and they could refuse to come to work. So that is a situation we're looking to avoid. If you have any acceptance at all that the employee would be right in saying that there's an imminent risk to them, you shouldn't be asking them to come to the workplace.
There's a question come in, which I think is probably useful to clarify just now, is that whether the company's duty of care extends beyond employees to those who are perhaps retained on a consultancy basis, or who might be have worker status as opposed to employee status. And the answer to that is yes, it does. The Health and Safety at Work Act covers duties both to your employees, and that is interpreted quite broadly, but also to any other person who might be affected by your business. It's described as your undertaking in the legislation, but business is easier for us to understand. So yes, it covers members of the public coming into your premises. It covers people you retain as consultants, customers, clients, family members of workers who are coming into your premises. So yes, the duty of care is an extremely broad one. Effectively, anyone that your business interacts with, you have a duty of care under the health and safety legislation to minimise, as Helen says, as far as reasonably practicable, their risk of exposure to coronavirus.
Sarah, would you consider an employee faced with childcare issues until the schools have fully or more fully reopened, would that form part of a reasonable conversation, would it, with an employer as to whether that person should return to work or not?
Yeah, depending on the age of the children, depending on their individual arrangements, then these are the conversations that we need to be having. And for a lot of employers, lines are being crossed, but this has been happening for the last few weeks. While we've been at home, we're finding we're talking about things that we didn't used to talk about, and people are sharing parts of their lives that they never used to. I have a yellow lamp behind me, no one used to know that. You know, there's this closeness that's coming from this new environment that we're working in, and hopefully if those conversations have been being maintained, then this is just a continuation. If those conversations haven't yet happened, then you're in for a rockier time just now to have them. Ensuring that trust is there so people can be open about their personal situations. People have genuine reasons that make it very difficult for them to be working just now, and employers need to listen to those and act reasonably. And just in any situation where you're thinking that someone needs to be dismissed, reasonableness has always been at the heart of that situation, and all the more so now. But the lengths to which employers will be expected to go to are much longer. The expectations of them being understanding are much higher because of the extreme circumstances that we're in, which is why the focus is on communication, building trust, understanding of individual circumstances, and not trying to make one size fit all when it blatantly doesn't work that way.
I'd just add one thing as well on culture, and for businesses that are, you know, perhaps haven't previously been operating in the kind of sectors where you use PPE all the time and people think about health and safety a lot. But we know from advising businesses that culture is incredibly important around fostering that culture whereby people recognise that following the rules, following the social distancing requirements, observing the staggered lunch times or break times or start times, you know, being very strict about that kind of thing is really important because it's protecting people. And it's always important that that's led from the top. So if you're telling people that they need to wear PPE to do a certain activity and then the managing director walks onto the floor not wearing PPE, it really undermines the message. So you've got to lead from the top, and you've got to make sure that your management team are absolutely on board with it and are not just kind of paying lip service to it, but are really invested in it, because that message spreads very quickly into the workforce as well.
And there is, Helen, there's a history of prosecution for exactly that. I had a case for a quite high risk organisation where senior personnel were not wearing PPE that was provided to more junior personnel. A culture developed where, well, if they're not wearing it, why should I? And someone died as a result of not having the PPE, and there was a successful prosecution of the organisation based entirely around the cultural impact of senior staff appearing to think it wasn't necessary or didn't apply to them. So it is a real risk, particularly in the current climate.
On the question of PPE, a few people have asked about this. To what extent is the employer responsible for the availability of PPE, and indeed also providing, you know, training on how to use it safely and properly and effectively?
Yeah, I think if you are providing PPE and you think that PPE is necessary to manage risks in your workplace, you've definitely got to provide training to people on how to use it properly. Otherwise, it's just a waste of time. You know, clearly there are availability issues, and so it may be that it's in your medium-term plan that you want everyone to wear PPE, or it may be that you realise that certain activities can't take place until you're able to get your hands on that PPE, but the other slightly lower risk activities can take place, for example. And I think that's the reason, you know, the government has kind of shied away from asking employers and companies to use PPE, because they're aware of the additional burdens that may well face on the supply chain that's already quite stretched. Yeah. But I think, you know, if you think you need it, you probably do need to try and get hold of it.
Okay. Sarah, coming back to yourself, I think it was mentioned earlier by Helen that we're due to hear more imminently on the possible extension of the furlough scheme or adjustments to that scheme. first of all, any insights on what you think may be coming there? And secondly, where employers have staff who are furloughed, they'll obviously be putting their premises into COVID-19 secure condition per the measures. How does an employer go about determining which employees to bring back into the workplace? Should that be phased? You know, what observations do you have around the practicalities of that?
Sure. So first of all, yeah, very excited to hear what comes today about the job retention scheme. Originally, it was due to expire at the end of May, and then in the middle of April, an extension was announced. So we're now nearing the middle of May, and again, it's the same time scale, and that's not a coincidence. That reflects the fact that if the furlough scheme is brought to an end, there may be a requirement for redundancies, and there's a need to consult before redundancies are made. So a really important decision. My best guess is it will be extended, but it probably won't look the same as it does at the moment. And at the moment, it's been very clear that furlough is all or nothing. You're at home, you must not work. There's been a lot of concern from business about how this is going to work during the cautious reopening, when you don't need as many people working as you did previously, because perhaps you cannot safely have that number of people in the workplace due to social distancing, or the demand simply isn't there. So it is hoped that there'll be some reflection of this and some greater flexibility in the scheme. Query also whether the payments will stay the same. 80% of pay capped at 2,500. Both of those could shift. Possibility that employers may be asked to make a bit of a contribution. So say employee still gets 80%, but 20% comes from employer, 60% from the government. We don't know. There's mixed feeling, we understand, in government, some concern if you just keep paying people to sit at home, you're disincentivizing them to work. Not entirely convinced that's fair, but these are the issues, the concerns that are being expressed, and at the same time, is money going towards roles that will inevitably be made redundant at the end of furlough, and if so, why? And so perhaps by requiring employers to pay a proportion, you reduce that risk and allow them to focus on the jobs that they know for sure they want to maintain in the longer term. So I don't know, but we will find out today. Hopeful that there will be an extension, particularly now that the roadmap has paved out, as we've seen, that there's a considerable period of time before industries are going to be open, particularly hospitality. That's all being well with the virus numbers, obviously. So if you're thinking about who to bring back from furlough in a stage basis, bear in mind, and I say this in response to some of the questions, if people can still work from home, then they can go from being furloughed to working from home. It isn't necessarily furlough ends and people are back to the workplace, because the primary starting point is if it's safe to work from home, then stay at home, keep doing that. It keeps the pressure off public transport, etc. But if work cannot be done from home and you're considering who's coming back to the workplace, then you need to make the workplace COVID secure, and you need to think about business need. Focus on what are the key roles that you need to get back up and running, rather than which people do you need. Once you've then focused on what your staged or phased return looks like, what those roles are, you need to talk to your individual employees about that. One way of doing this could potentially be to set out phase 1 will be these roles, phase 2 will be these roles. This is our proposal, but we want to talk to you about it. Giving employees the opportunity to express their personal concerns about being put in that particular category. So some questions coming in about what if people are suffering from mental health, from being at home and desperately are crying out to be back in the workplace. Can you listen to that? I would say it's reasonable to listen to that. And so again, going back to the individual circumstances and taking those into account to the best of your ability. You may prefer to ask for volunteers in the same way that you may do with redundancies, making it clear that you don't guarantee that you give someone what they're asking for, but the starting point to ask people what's their preference in terms of the different stages of phasing back to the workplace, and see what people say and see if that is helpful and if you can work with that. Perhaps being clear what the business core needs are at the outset. But you're looking to avoid discriminatory actions whilst taking into account the guidance which allows you to pay particular care to vulnerable people, to pregnant people, to those who have medical conditions, etc. And anybody with existing medical conditions that fit the disability definition, you need to make reasonable adjustments for them anyway, which could mean various things depending on their own individual circumstances.
I would just add, Sarah, on the health and safety, you know, the duty applies actually even if you've got a large number of your workforce working at home as well. So do think about that, because we've had quite a few questions about things like workstation assessments. You know, clearly lots of people are going to be sitting on, you know, not office chairs and perched on the end of a bed or something like that. It's not going to be practical to send somebody out to do a workstation assessment to people in their home, but it's perfectly possible for them to sort of do a self-assessment using software or something like that online. And you can, as an employer, you can certainly provide guidance to them on setting up their workstation in a way that's not going to cause them, you know, long-term pain issues with bad backs and that kind of thing, and making sure that they move regularly, and providing some help as well around mental health, because we know that that is a big issue for a lot of people who are working at home and feeling quite isolated. So, you know, do remember that part of your workforce who are working at home as well, and you still have duties towards them.
There's a question come in on that as well around whether if you have employees who are working from home who don't have a home office, and ours, you say, Helen, perched on the end of a bed or sharing a kitchen table, is the employer obliged to reopen the office to allow them to come back to work? My view on that is no. I think you're looking at an overall management of the overall risk profile. Yeah. And yes, there is arguably a risk to that employee, as Helen says, of long-term back pain, or the obvious one at the moment are eyesight problems, says the guy wearing glasses, if you're spending a lot of time staring at a laptop screen. But in the overall balancing of risk, opening the office to allow them to come back in, which involves them travelling, much more increased potential contact points in public areas outside the workplace, within the workplace as well. I think you're perfectly justified as an employer to say, we'll do all that we reasonably can to help you develop a comfortable workspace home, but we're not reopening the workplace just because you don't have a home desk. So I think you'd be perfectly justified as an employer in saying, you may want to come back into the office, but our judgment, our assessment is that is not overall the safest thing for you or for the rest of our workforce.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'll mention this again at the end, but thanks for the continuing questions. They are coming in thick and fast. Apologies if we don't get to your specific question in the time that remains. We're trying to pick up on a few of the repeated themes, but we will be addressing all your questions afterwards and summarizing these, and we can circulate notes after this session. There are a few questions around, Sarah, around the question of whether or not in this sort of reasonable discussion between an employer and employee, whether or not it's reasonable to pay or not to pay, to expect to have to pay or not an employee who has made a decision to stay at home in order to protect, say, a vulnerable member of the household or perhaps a small child.
Yeah, and this is probably the most difficult question of all. And the answer should be follow the government guidance, and that tends to veer towards, in extreme circumstances where there's reason that the job can't be done, that you adjust that, and you perhaps have them carrying out a different role at home if they agree to do so. the spirit of it all is that you find them something to do and you pay them accordingly. Now, there may be situations where that doesn't work, and you may want to have a conversation about agreeing different hours, a reduced working situation for a period of time. But in all of it, there's an expectation of reasonableness in response to what the individual situation is. There's not a one size fits all with this. And in some circumstances, it may be that you come to a position that you don't require the person to work, but if they are willing and they're wanting to work, and there's something they could be able to do, then you should be looking at that, making that happen.
It's a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
Slightly different tack here. I think perhaps about retail and other service type situations. And I know these are likely to reopen in stages, but what about duties to customers in a face-to-face context? Any thoughts on that? Perhaps Malcolm or Helen?
I'll let you go first, will I, Helen?
Yeah, well, there is some guidance on shops and branches that in the government guidance that was issued yesterday, and I've seen a couple of questions asking about where that's available on the gov.uk COVID hub. There's links to that guidance for specific customer settings, and one of them is retail. And clearly, there's been a lot of retail operators that have been open all through this, and who no doubt will have learned quite a lot about how to protect their own workforce as well as protecting their customers. And so I think I'd starting point look at that guidance. I'd also look at some of the stuff that's been coming out from the Retail Federation as well, because I think they've been doing some sector specific stuff around this. For shops, I would have thought probably it's your employees who are probably at greater risk, because they're getting, if you like, the more prolonged exposure to people who are coming in and out all day long. But you will certainly have a duty towards your customers as well. And again, it's going to be about doing what's reasonably practicable. So that may be, limiting how many people are in the shop, perhaps having some kind of one-way system around the shop, asking people to sanitize their hands when they come in, asking people not to touch anything unless they are actually definitely going to buy it, perhaps changing the way that you actually serve customers, making it much less easy for them to kind of be touching lots of things if they're not going to buy them. I think all of those are quite sensible, practical considerations to bear in mind.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is that the risk, I think, of civil liability claims is much reduced from customers. As Helen says, it's your employees who will get the lengthy or potentially lengthy exposure. So I think that whilst the duties definitely exist under the health and safety legislation, I think the prospect of a customer being able to bring a successful claim saying they came into your premises and contracted coronavirus is pretty limited. That's even assuming they can get past the difficulty of actually establishing that your premises are where they got coronavirus. So I think it is much more a health and safety duties question than a civil liability question when you come to customers or clients.
It's worth saying as well that if you do become aware that somebody has contracted COVID and you think it's at work, you've got a reasonable suspicion that it's happened in the workplace, or you've got a bit of an outbreak in one of your workplaces, or even you've had such a failure of the systems, that the systems just weren't observed and there's been a significant risk of exposure, you do have an obligation to notify the HSE under RIDDOR. So some of you will be familiar with RIDDOR reporting. If somebody suffers a serious accident at work, or there's a near miss where there could have been a serious accident, you have to report that to RIDDOR, and COVID-19 is one of those notifiable diseases. So not just if somebody in your workforce becomes symptomatic and you don't think that they acquired it at work, you don't have to notify that. But if you think it was a workplace related issue, then you do need to notify it. And there's a form on the HSE website for doing that.
And again, for Malcolm and Helen in particular, it won't be possible for businesses in all cases, in most cases probably, to flick a switch and suddenly they're COVID-19 secure in terms of the physical steps that they need to to take in the workplace, various workplace settings that we've spoken about. What is the position through the period of time that these changes are being made? Is it a case that business needs to have got to a certain stage before it can allow a return to work for some or all of its workforce, or can that be sort of gradually brought in as the environment is turned into a compliant, secure, COVID-secure environment?
The government guidance says employers should comply with it as soon as reasonably practicable. When I read that last night, my immediate reaction was that period is probably the period of highest risk for employers, because if you open now and the workplace isn't COVID secure, and you have a full complement of staff in the workplace, I think that is the period of time where there's the greatest exposure. And I suspect, I saw that the Prime Minister announced last night there's going to be spot checks on businesses. Now, there's not a lot of detail around that, but we presume it will be the HSE. I would imagine those spot checks will be at their highest in this initial period when businesses have reopened, employees are coming back into work, but perhaps the full measures are not in place. So I think you can. There's nothing in the guidance that says you can't. In fact, the guidance it seems to suggest you can open whilst you're developing your safety systems. My advice would be only do that with the minimum number of staff that you need in the workplace to implement those safety systems. I mean, clearly, if you're talking about moving workstations so they're different distances apart, or making, as the guidance says, adjustments to bathroom facilities to replace hand dryers with towels, to having social distancing markings to ensure that in showers and kitchen areas that social distancing is obeyed, and that there's increased sanitation provision. All of that's going to require people in the workplace, clearly. But I think you should, in that transition period, until you're satisfied you've met the requirements of the guidance, the minimum number of people in the office premises or the workplace is the right thing to have, the right process to follow.
And I would have thought you may want to, if you've got multiple sites, you may want to do it on a phased approach and open one or two, make sure that you've got people comfortable with the processes, learn anything that you need to learn from the experience of doing that with a small number of premises perhaps before, rather than sort of, opening all 500 premises on day one. And it's behavioural change that's going to be very, very hard. You can put in the signs and you can put in the, spacing and maybe make more space between workstations, that sort of thing. But what you're asking people to do is a really significant behavioural change to what they were doing before. And that's very hard to enforce. And you need to build in quite a lot of time for your teams to kind of get to grips with the new systems. I think it's hard to we know that it's difficult to get human beings to change things that they've been doing, particularly if they've got a routine as to what they normally do when they come into work. If you're changing that, you have to factor in that will be difficult.
There's a few questions just while we're talking about physical changes to the workplace, a few questions coming in around can you close the bathrooms or the shower facilities? What about kitchen facilities? The sort of tension between COVID security and the wider HSE regulations around making these things available in the workplace. So the guidance is very clear. You're not expected to close bathrooms or take away tea and coffee making facilities. Or, as a question's come in, do you have to turn off the hand dryers? No, the answer is that you don't have to do any of that. What it seems to be focusing on is identifying areas where queues are likely to develop or people are likely to congregate, and trying to find ways of minimizing that congestion. So instead of just having a hand dryer in the bathroom, you also provide separate paper towels so that people aren't joining a queue at the hand dryer. In the tea and coffee making facility, there are markers on the ground so that people maintain social distancing and they don't gather around the kettle or reach over each other to get to the coffee granules. One of the issues I know they've seen in supermarkets has been customers reaching over people who are stocking the shelves, and therefore breaching social distancing. So it's these kind of things that the guidance is trying to address. How do you keep the workplace functioning whilst avoiding these points of congestion. So no, you don't close the kitchens, you don't close the bathrooms, but you do, as Helen says, have to effect a behavioural change about the way that the people use those facilities. And it may be that you have one route into the bathroom from the shop floor or the office space, and another route back into the workspace from the bathroom facilities to try and minimise those contact points. But it's not a case of closing these facilities in the workplace.
A couple of interesting questions. There appears to be evidence that those in the BAME community are at greater risk of contracting the virus. That and the broader question, do employers have to take account of socioeconomic factors in their risk assessment? That being one element, but there will be others.
I think you probably do. I think you have to take you know, the vulnerabilities of your workforce into account, and in some cases that may mean you having information about them that you wouldn't normally hold as well. So it's really important about how you use that data, and that you're using that data specifically for, you know, risk assessment to do with COVID-19 and not for any other purpose. But I think if you're aware of that, I think you probably do need to take that into account in your risk assessment and in your mitigation measures as well.
Yeah,
that's the health and safety angle. I don't know if there's, Sarah, sort of more of an employment law angle to it or not, but
I think it reflects what I've been saying previously about the individual discussions, and if someone has a genuine concern that due to their ethnicity they're at a serious and imminent danger that other people aren't, then they will express that, and then we get back into the, is that reasonable for them to believe that? It hasn't yet come through in any of the guidance. They're not being treated as one of the special category of vulnerable groups yet. That could change. So we need to keep an eye on the guidance, which is changing all the time, and I think the research is at early stages on that. But it's the same issue. It's the health and safety legislation protection, and any concerns being raised also giving you the protection of being a whistleblower, because you're sharing concerns about health and safety risks. So taking those seriously and not subjecting someone to a detriment because of those. But the question of reasonable belief is still at the key of it.
We did touch on this earlier, I think, but quite a lot of questions about people working from home. Can they ask the employer to, can they require the employer to provide appropriate equipment, laptops, screens, chairs, whatever. I think there was there were a few observations about that earlier. Maybe we just kind of repeat the comments there.
I think because we have been asked the question about, you know, do you have to kind of provide a special ergonomic chair for all of your employees? And generally, I think the answer is no. I think if there's, it's about doing what's reasonably practicable for you as a business. And so I think you also have to, you know, think about what is, I think, providing sort of maybe cheaper equipment, you know, providing guidance on how people set up their workstation. At the start of this, you know, we advise people to sort of be allowed to take home their keyboards and their mice and that kind of thing, so they can plug that in. I think for, you know, as to whether or not you provide specific equipment to people in their homes now, I think that's going to be for each business to kind of assess based on, you know, the reality of the situation they face. They simply may not be able to afford to do that. But you can't do nothing. I think you do have to try and do something to make sure that people are aware of the risks of the new way of working at home, and for businesses to do what's reasonably practicable to help them to manage those risks. And that may be through guidance, or it may be through the provision of equipment, but that's for a decision. But there's certainly no sort of regulatory requirement that says you have to provide everybody with a chair and a desk and a screen and all that sort of thing.
Employees, sorry.
I was just going to say the much simpler solution, often from the perspective of workplace equipment, is just to allow people to change the way they work. So if sitting for long periods of time without an ergonomic chair is the problem, or if spending hours looking at a laptop screen is the issue, then saying to someone, well, only work for 45 minutes and take a 15-minute break, and adjusting your expectations of your staff in that respect is a much more practical and probably a much cheaper option than providing ergonomic chairs. And as Helen says, that's not a requirement anyway. So certainly where I've been speaking to businesses, that's the advice I've been giving, is think about changes to the way of working rather than the physical infrastructure, and that will usually allow you to get round the problems without spending a fortune on 500 screens and 600 ergonomic chairs. Sorry, Sarah, I cut across you.
No, not at all. I was just going to add in the additional obligations that will apply to disabled employees, so people with particular conditions, that you were probably already making adjustments in the normal workplace to enable them to do to do their role. Special requirements may be needed in the home workplace as well, that apply reasonable adjustments in response to their disability.
There have been a couple of questions about risk assessment processes, and that would suggest to me that it would be quite helpful for people to have some sort of template that they could perhaps work to in considering how the government guidelines should apply in their particular cases. That would be something we can assist with. I would have thought, Helen.
There's definitely, I think that the HSE has got some interactive tools on its website, which may help. And the HSE in Northern Ireland, I think, actually did publish a COVID-19 risk assessment template. Right. The only thing with templates is, the risk assessment does need to be bespoke. It does need to be done for your business. It does need to be specific to the particular arrangements in place. So I would just say, there are interactive tools on the HSE website which are quite helpful. But for more complex businesses, that they're probably not going to be appropriate, and do use them with caution.
The guidance document itself is actually quite a helpful template, because it works through and it has objective checklists and tick boxes. So it wouldn't suffice as the risk assessment, but in terms of a methodology and a process, if you work through the guidance, actually it goes through all the things we've discussed this morning around what do you do with certain categories of employees, what do you do with different parts of the workplace, sanitation facilities, catering facilities. It covers all of that. So it's not a template for the risk assessment, but it's quite a good process to work through. There's also been a question, Kenneth, I saw come in about publication of the risk assessment, and I think expressing surprise perhaps that there's a suggestion from the government that these should be published.
Yeah.
To answer the question, yes, that it's not a legal requirement, but the government are expecting employees to publicly disclose their risk assessments, presumably I'm guessing they're thinking on websites or some other social media. But yes, there is an expectation, if not a requirement, that employers will publish their risk assessments, which is a complete change to the norm, and does raise some interesting questions around confidential information and process, because particularly in manufacturing, I can see that you will have to include in your risk assessment details of your processes, and maybe that you don't want your competitors to know what your processes are. Now, I guess that comes down to a very commercial judgment. Is the greater risk staying closed and losing revenue, or opening and having to disclose what might be quite commercially sensitive information?
But I think if you have got good reasons not to, not to make it public, I think it's probably reasonable to say that, and to keep it confidential. Or it may be that you share it with your employees, but on a confidential basis, and not make it public outside the organisation.
Or redact certain parts of it that are commercially sensitive and publish a slightly abridged version.
Yeah.
So look, I think that's our hour up, and I feel we should draw it to a close. As I said earlier on, we will be sending out an email within the next couple of days, which will include links to a recording of this session. And also to the Dentons COVID-19 Hub, which is a global coverage document which is updated constantly with insights on developments in the UK and around the world, which I would encourage our guests to dip in and out of from time to time. Do feel free to share these with any of your colleagues who may find them useful. We will also pick up on the questions that have come through from you all. Thank you very much for that. There have been plenty of them. Thanks to Helen, to Sarah and Malcolm for joining me this morning. and thanks to you all for participating. I hope you found it useful. We would be delighted to pick up with anyone on any specific thoughts after this session, and indeed that would include thoughts on further areas you'd like to hear about. We will be running these sessions again as we see this all unfolding and more information come out. If I could just, on a slightly lighter note, before we head out for the rest of the day, observe I'm a very passionate supporter of the Scottish national football team, but I have to say I was somewhat struck last night when someone sent me a note that reads, "So Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are to stay at home." Sounds more like the World Cup finals. So on that note, please enjoy your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.